very excited to have a launch tonight. We are discussing Uncontrollable Women, Radicals, Reformers and Revolutionaries by Nan Sloane. Uncontrollable Women charts the history of forgotten women revolutionaries between the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 and the passing of the Great Reform Act in 1832. Nan is an author, speaker and trainer with an interest in the role of women in the public space, particularly in politics and the Labour Party. Her previous books include The Women in the Room, Labour's Forgotten History, In Our Own Words, A Dictionary of Women's Political Quotations, and A Great Act of Justice, The Flapper Election and After. Nan's going to introduce the book and then we will be taking questions from the audience. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to post your questions, as well as a chat for just general discussion and commentary on what's going on. And if you feel like tweeting, we are at Housmans Books there as well. With that, I'm going to hand over to Nan, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. And may I say, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. This is the first event that I have done for this book, so I'm really excited to be able to share it with you and to see what you think and hear your questions and opinions. As Alice said, the book is about political women, radical political women, between the French Revolution and the Great Reform Act. And one of the questions that I have most often been asked about this is why choose to write about women in that period? Because with one or two exceptions, like Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Austen, most people haven't heard of women in that particular time. The politics of the time are very male. People know about kings, dukes and battles, or bonnets, frocks and scandal, but often not much else in between. And yet it was one of the most radical periods in history from the point of view of the sheer scale of activism, the sheer scale of the ambition that women had, particularly working class women, and the closeness that Britain came to revolution. So we have, on the one hand, a very large, radical, and sometimes actually revolutionary parts of the population, and on the other hand, a very repressive and oppressive government, terrified that Britain was going to tip into the same kind of difficulties that France were having. So that's the first thing, is because it's a little known period, because there are assumptions made about women in that period. The second thing is that we tend to look at the history of political women through the prism of the campaign for female suffrage, and therefore to discount the activism of women outside the suffrage movement. And that has several consequences. One is to disproportionately cover the history of middle and upper class women and not the history of working class women, who were often more involved in trade unions and local politics than they were in the suffrage campaign. But it also means that we're blindsided when it comes to women who were active in politics before the suffrage campaign existed. So none of the women in this book is campaigning for female suffrage, for the simple reason that it would have seemed an extraordinary thing for them to do. Even Mary Wollstonecraft said that she knew she would excite laughter if she proposed votes for women or women in Parliament. And until almost towards the end, we get to a woman called Anna Doyle Wheeler, who did begin to consider what a political, what politics which included women might look like. It was outside what most women would have imagined could possibly happen. It's also a period despite that, which is full of amazing women who pushed at or stepped right over the boundaries that they were given, and who almost for the first time began using their voices in the public space. And as we know, women's voices in the public political space are still contentious, still subject to all kinds of challenge, and still a matter for discussion as to not necessarily whether or not they belong there, but what they can and can't do when they're there. So it runs through, the question runs through the book, and is often very relevant to some of the things we see happening now. So that's why I wrote it. I thought there was a lot in it that was really relevant. There's some fantastic women, and I thought they should be better known, better understood, and just talked about more and researched more. And I hope that people will perhaps pick some of these women up and try to find out more about them. I want, in the next few minutes, just to set a scene, if you like, for where working class women in particular were at this point, and then to read 3 short extracts from the book relating to some of the earliest women's political organisations and how they were received at the time, because I think that is also illuminating. I mean, it's perhaps fortunate that social media was not around at the time, because they would certainly have found themselves on the receiving end of quite a lot of abuse. But I want to look first at what women's lives were like. At the turn of the 19th century, women had no rights of any kind. So they didn't have legal rights, they didn't have political rights, they didn't have social or economic or personal rights. Married women in particular were entirely the property of their husbands. They could not own their own money. They could not make a will. They could not sue or be sued. They could not borrow money. If they earned money, it belonged to their husbands. So the author, Mrs. Gaskell, who wrote Cranford and North and South and other well-known novels a little later in the century, and was a best-selling author, but her earnings were paid to her husband, and he doled her out an allowance. And she complained often about the size of the allowance, but she didn't challenge the basic principle. And that's one of the things that is hard for us to grasp sometimes. Why didn't women challenge this? And the answer is because this was the life that they were in. This is the society that they were in. It's extremely difficult for them to think outside the boundaries in the way that we now would see as normal. Middle and upper class women were not expected to appear in public, and not apart from things like going to church or social events or things of that nature, when sanctioned by their husbands, who could lock them up in the house if they chose to. They were certainly not expected to speak in public. They were not expected to appear on public platforms. They were not expected to express an opinion. They were not expected to take any part in the politics of the time. And since they were effectively banned from any political participation, most women didn't, other than to support husbands and fathers and sometimes sons. Working class women had a little more freedom, if only because if they didn't go out to work, they and their children would starve, literally starve, at the period covered in the book. So they went to work, often in appalling conditions. Many of them were in effect migrant women, because this is the period of the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, when huge numbers of people migrated from the countryside into the new towns of the Midlands and the North, and migrated into appalling conditions. There were no houses for them. There was no sanitation. There was not enough food. Food supplies were short because of the migration from the agricultural areas, and trade was very slow. So they lived very challenging lives, but they could get out of the house. They went to work. They went to markets to buy food and anything else they could afford. They were often part of social groups based around churches or clubs or other organisations of that nature. And they did participate in some political activity, depending on how you define riot. And women were heavily involved in rioting, particularly in food rioting, which usually happened when food supplies were growing short, and women could see what was coming. Women could see that extreme deprivation or even starvation was coming. And there is in the book a whole section about food riots and what happened during them, and the curious way in which they were regarded by the authorities. So the other thing about working class women that is perhaps slightly surprising is that they were much more literate than we sometimes think. They were often portrayed by the middle classes and by the middle class media as ignorant and uneducated, if not downright stupid. But in fact, they tended to have at least a basic education. Most could read, some could also write. This was a time when Methodist Sunday schools were teaching both girls and boys to read and write. There were schools run by reform clubs and reform organisations that taught girls at least to read and often to write. And so literacy rates for women, which declined in the early Victorian age, were actually quite high at this age. So women didn't need men to read things to them for them to be able to access political writings, pamphlets, books, provided that somebody could afford to buy them. Women could afford to read them. But they were not expected to use their voices in public arenas. There were a few female preachers who attracted big crowds, but generally speaking, working class women were as excluded from the political sphere as middle and upper class women were. In the book, I've looked at women from across the class divide. So there are middle class women, there are political philosophers, there are thinkers, there's a woman called Helen Mariah Williams, who was one of the first women to embed herself in a major international event and report back from it, in this case, the French Revolution. They are all fantastic figures, but for the purposes of this evening, and not to sort of overload you with one name after another name after another name, I thought I would just look at the first working class women's organisations in the north of England. And then, as I say, just read a few short extracts about them. The parliamentary reform movement was, in the 1810s, an enormous working class movement. It had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people involved, and probably at its height, millions. It was seen by working class people as the answer to their problem. the vote in particular was seen as the answer to their problem. This was not universal suffrage as we understand it. It was adult male suffrage. But nevertheless, since most adult males could not vote, they saw that getting the vote and getting working class men into Parliament would change the way in which politics worked, would change the way in which the economy worked, and would ultimately be to their benefit. And you have to remember that the people who populated Parliament were, at least in part, the people who were benefiting from the Industrial Revolution. So at this stage, Parliament had no particular reason to be passing legislation which would improve conditions for the industrial poor, and in fact, every incentive not to do that. And every town and every village had its own parliamentary reform society. Some of them enormous, some of them quite small, but these societies provided the focus for organisation for men. And one of the things that they were doing in 1819 was organising, led by national figures like Henry Hunt, who was a sort of superstar of the reform movement, organising a series of increasingly large public meetings on Mondays, which was the usual day off. People didn't have Saturday and Sunday, they had Sunday and Monday. And attracting huge crowds with national speakers to demand parliamentary reform. And this was designed, these were happening every week somewhere in the country, and they were designed to build up to the biggest meeting, which was intended to be in Manchester in August, and which they knew as the Manchester meeting, but we know as Peterloo. And one of the things that happened, these meetings have been happening through the spring and early summer on, as I say, more or less a weekly basis. One of the things that started to happen is that the women who weren't members of the male reform societies decided to organise themselves into reform societies. And so in industrial towns across Lancashire and Yorkshire, and in one or two other places, a whole series of female reform societies began to be organised by the women themselves with the intention of supporting the wider campaign. So they were not supporting votes for themselves, they were supporting votes for their men. And somebody said to me on one occasion, well, doesn't that, isn't that, why weren't they? Doesn't that make them, less interesting because they were campaigning for the men? And I think that in a way diminishes their achievement, because there was no question of women having votes, but people can only do what they have the vision for within their own society, and they like their husbands, fathers and sons, saw votes for men, for working class men, as the answer to all of their problems. So, I think we should cut them a bit of slack on that score. One of the things that they did was to begin to appear on public platforms, and to, even more shockingly, speak from public platforms in new ways, or ways that were new for them. So I'm going to read you three extracts. One is about the first appearance of these women in Blackburn at the series of meetings that were being organised were called monster meetings, and this was a monster meeting in Blackburn. The second about how these new societies were, and the women in them, were treated in the press. and the third about the female reformers of Manchester, who wrote an address called Dear Sisters of the Earth, which I always think has a surprisingly modern ring. So if we start with the Blackburn Women, on the 5th of July, 1819, the Blackburn female reformers took part in a historic occasion, becoming the first working class women to have a formal role at a political event. Their performance had been well planned in advance and had a theatrical feel to it that other parts of the programme may have lacked. The reformer colours were green and white, and the women all wore white dresses and bonnets with green sashes and cockades. This not only identified them as a group, but also enabled them to stand out from the darker, more drab colours worn by the crowd. At an agreed point, the women gathered at the edge of the huge assembly and waited until the stewards had indicated their presence to John Knight, who was in the chair. He then beckoned them to come forwards. The crowd, being instructed by Knight to make way for the ladies, and sensing that here was something new and possibly entertaining, parted to allow them through and cheered enthusiastically as they went. Arriving at the platform, they mounted it to more cheers of God bless the women, and Mrs. Alice Kitchen now advanced towards Knight and, with becoming diffidence and respect, presented him with a most beautiful cap of liberty, made of scarlet silk or satin, lined with green, with a serpentine gold lace, terminating with a rich gold tassel. I should just say the cap of liberty was a great revolutionary symbol used throughout the French Revolution, and which struck terror into the heart of the establishment in this country. Having handed over the cap, Alice Kitchen then abandoned the traditional female role of modest silence in the public space and made what was described as a short, emphatic speech. She said that the cap was a token of our respect to those brave men who are nobly struggling for liberty and life, and passed tonight the Blackburn Female Reformers Society address, which she requested him to read out, and which she said embraces a faint description of our woes and may apologise for our interference in the politics of our country. Although the address was not read out by a female voice, it represents one of the earliest political pronouncements from a public platform made by a group of women, and especially northern working class women in Britain. As usual, it was subsequently claimed it was written by a man, but whoever wrote it, it was a very effective piece of work. After some introductory flourishes about the presentation of the cap, the women said that they had the avowed determination of instilling into the minds of our children a deep-rooted abhorrence of tyranny, come in what shape it may, and particularly of the present boroughmongering and Jesuitical system, which has brought the best artisans, manufacturers, and labourers of this vast community to a state of wretchedness and misery, and driven them to the very verge of beggary and ruin. The address then proceeded to outline the suffering being caused by the post-war depression, the poor harvest, and in particular by the taxation system, including the new corn laws, which kept the price of bread artificially high. The women said that our houses, which once bore ample testimony of our industry and cleanliness and were fit for the reception of a prince, are now, alas, robbed of all their ornaments, and our beds that once afforded us cleanliness, health, and sweet repose are now torn away from us by the relentless hand of the unfeeling tax gatherer to satisfy the greatest monsters of cruelty, who are reposing on beds of down, while nothing is left us to stretch our weary limbs upon but a sheaf of straw laid on the cold ground, with insufficient covering to shelter us from the inclemency of the weather. But above all, behold our innocent, wretched children, sweet emblems of our mutual love. How appalling are their cries for bread. We cannot describe our wretchedness, for language cannot paint the feelings of a mother when she beholds her naked children and hears their inoffensive cries of hunger and approaching death. The men were entreated to come forward and join the general union, that by a determined and constitutional resistance to our oppressors, the people may obtain annual parliaments, universal suffrage, and election by ballot, which alone can save us from lingering misery and premature death. We look forward with horror to an approaching winter when the necessity of food, clothing, and every requisite will increase double-fold. Finally, the women concluded by pledging to do everything they could to support the cause. Given the length at which the men tended to speak, and the florid nature of much of the language employed at this time, it was in its way a little masterpiece of a speech, containing a call to action, an explanation for the reasons for that call, an appeal to the emotions as well as to reason, and finally a pledge to act themselves. At the end, and to much applause, a vote of thanks to them was proposed and passed, following which the women stayed on the platform for the remainder of the meeting. When all the speakers had been heard and all the resolutions passed, both male and female members of the platform party adjourned to the nearby General Wolfe Inn, where they ate what the Manchester Observer described as a frugal but substantial and excellent dinner, after which many toasts were drunk, the first being the female reformers of Blackburn, and may their example be speedily followed throughout the United Kingdom. So that's the first appearance of female reformers, welcomed by the Manchester Observer, but shocking to other people. And the second thing I'm going to read is briefly quite how shocking people found it was. The events in the cotton towns, particularly the ceremonial of the Blackburn mass meeting, were widely reported and commented on, with predictably different slants depending on the standpoint of different outlets. The Manchester Observer regarded the appearance of the female reformers as interesting and enchanting. However, anti-radical papers were unanimous in their condemnation, and since the unregulated press of the early 19th century had much in common with the unregulated social media of the early 21st, there was very little limit to what they could publish. The Times, for instance, reported with repugnance one novel and most disgusting scene. A deputation from the Blackburn Female Reform Society mounted the stage to present a cap of liberty and an address to the meeting. These women then mixed with the orators and remained on the hustings during the rest of the day. The public scarcely need to be informed that the females are women well known to be the most abandoned of their sex. One disgusted Blackburn correspondent wrote to the Morning Post in London that our female reformers had a council extraordinary this morning, which I am told was very numerously attended. With the names of the chairwoman and different lady speakers, it would be idle to trouble you. They can never shine brighter than by being left in their native obscurity. The business of the day was to consider the best means of forwarding the great object for which they have abandoned their proper domestic cares and given themselves up to the mania of mending constitutions, to the neglect of the more befitting occupation of mending their husbands' breeches. Elsewhere, there was criticism of both sexes. Speaking of a meeting of female reformers in Stockport, the Bath Chronicle and Weekly Gazette thundered that these wretched creatures, in their eagerness to display their persons and let loose their tongues, forget how much more women are protected than restrained by the barrier which separates them from the toil and obloquy and hazard of public business. Cannot but surprise anyone who reflects upon the predominant influence of female vanity in low life. But what can be said of the feelings or morals of the fathers and husbands and brothers who have permitted or encouraged this violation of the sacred female privacy of which they are the appointed guardians? Happy indeed will they be if they only find that their wives, sisters, and daughters will return to the domestic commonwealth with powers of eloquence sharpened by practice and notions of sovereignty confirmed the contemplation of their collective importance. Some newspapers reported the Stockport meeting in rather more lurid terms than others. The Yorkshire Gazette informed its readers that the men had all left the meeting, taking with them their pipes and porter. One of them, we understand, was detected in conveying out of the room a bottle of brandy. But Mrs. President Hallworth insisted that they could not go on without it. Miss Whalley, seizing hold of it by the neck, twisted it out of the grip of the possessor and deposited it in triumph by the side of the chairwoman. After the speeches, they all sat down and filled out a glass of brandy. A committee of 12 were next appointed to act for the union. At about this time, the bottles were emptied, and it was carried by acclamation that another should be ordered in and chalked up to the male reformers below. It was also put to the vote and unanimously adopted that pipes for 3 should be allowed. The meeting dispersed at 10:30, and the several members assisted each other home as a symbol of that sisterly union and mutual support to which they had reciprocally pledged themselves. Another tactic was to suggest that the women were not as poor as they sought to portray themselves. One report of a public meeting at Lee alleged that the women's dress and appearance bore no marks of that misery and want which was said to prevail in Lee and the neighbourhood. Other papers reported with horror that after one member of the platform party was arrested, the chairman left his station, which for the remainder of the meeting was filled by a woman. Newspapers at the time reproduced one another's reports freely and without attribution. So accounts like this could and did appear in many local publications. But this was mild compared to a cartoon produced by George Cruikshank, the famous satirist, and published in mid-August. Called the Belle Alliance, or Female Reformers of Blackburn, the women on the platform are depicted as corpulent hags with their skirts tucked into their breeches. Their leader, who waves a rolled-up copy of the address, is shown without a nose, signifying syphilis. A speech balloon contains her remarks, which begin, "Master Chairman and brother, will you accept this token of our love by placing it on the head of your pole?" All the women are depicted as grotesques, and most wield daggers or alcohol. One is drawn with a bottle in each hand and a baby tucked under her arm, as she shouts to the men that we are some of the right sorts, my lads. Children brandish knives, and one man wears a petticoat. The whole scene is presented as both ludicrous and a monstrous inversion of the natural order. And finally, the Female Reformers of Manchester, who published an address to the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of the higher and middling class. On one level, given that the reform movement was heavily working class, this seems a slightly odd opening, but there was a purpose in it. The women were trying to establish the idea that all women shared a common experience, and that an evil done to one group could easily happen to all. Beginning Dear Sisters of the Earth, it opened by laying out the plight in which the working class women of Manchester found themselves as they tried to deal with food shortages and poor trade. It then went on to suggest to the middle class women that if things continued in this way, they themselves would be the next to suffer. Dear sisters, you may then fairly anticipate that when we are mixed with the silent dust, you will become the next victims of the voracious borough tyrants who will chase you in your turn to misery and death, till at length the middle and useful class of society is swept by their relentless hands from the face of creation. The only remedy for this was access to political power, and the female reformers urged their readers to exert your influence with your fathers, your husbands, your sons, your relatives, and your friends to join the male union for constitutionally demanding a reform or face miserable consequences. The address then attacked the recent Napoleonic Wars, which had been fought to replace on the throne the royal family, which had been removed by the revolution. and then went on to say that there was hope on the horizon. The progress of liberty and truth were irresistible, and people of all classes were banding together to demand reform. It concluded with a flourish by saying that corruption, tyranny, and injustice have reached their summit, and the bitter cup of oppression is now full to the brim. It was signed by the Secretary of the Female Reform Union by order of the committee. And because women's organisations are usually practical, it had a postscript which informed those interested that the committee will sit every Tuesday evening from 6 to 9 o'clock for the purpose of enrolling new members and transacting other such business. So this is in the lead up to Peterloo, and from it you can see that women were proactive. They were playing an active part in the politics of the time and of their communities. They were not simply silent victims. They were emerging into the public space and using their voice to defend what they believed to be their rights, and that they were remorselessly attacked for it. And the parallels between how women in the public space are treated then and now are sadly all too obvious. But the idea that this is a new phenomenon is also fairly obvious. These women's organisations did not survive Peterloo, generally speaking, but others did, and other working class women were involved also in other campaigns. I will stop there and take any questions, but I hope that has given you a flavour of some of the stories that are in Uncontrollable Women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please do send in your questions if you've got any, put them in the chat or in the Q&A. I can see that we have one question, which is more of a technical side of things. For those of you who missed the very beginning of the event, it will be recorded and we will post it online eventually. But so far, please, keep your questions coming in. I actually wanted to ask something a bit more specific. I'm interested in how the shift from the sort of rural migration into the cities seems to have been a really interesting organizing factor for a lot of these women. And I wonder how much the sort of social change that brought about enabled people to enter into different kinds of political conversations than they maybe would have if they'd stayed where they were.
Yes, I think that is very likely. People were, as always, when you get mass migration, uprooted from their communities, uprooted from their known network of social connections. And so they had to form new communities in whatever place they ended up in. And some people didn't move very far, but they might as well have moved continents because the society that they were entering was so different. Other people moved across the country. And that must have had both a destabilizing effect, but also promoted people making new connections, forming new communities, and becoming engaged in new forms of activism. In the 1790s, there were rural reform groups, not women, but certainly men. There were fewer by the 1810s. By the 1810s, the reform movement was heavily focused on urban areas, on dislocated communities, on people who had made a positive choice to move because it, was that or starve, but who also felt very resentful about the circumstances in which they found themselves living, and felt that there was no prospect of improvement unless they drove it. So I think it had a huge effect, and lots of families were sending money back to their original communities to keep older relatives from starving, or single men and women were moving into the towns in order to earn money to send back home. to pay for basic living costs. So it's all a recognisable pattern of how people behave when there is enormous dislocation and substantial movement of people from one form of life into another.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in, so I will pass over some of these audience questions for you. One of them has asked you about your research process and sort of where you started and if there were any resources or archives that were particularly useful. And I can imagine that there are probably some people in the audience who are thinking about maybe finding if there were reform societies in their area or how they could go about finding out more about the kind of local enactment of this history.
Well, there were reform societies all over the north of England and at least one in the west of England, because the woman who organised that wrote to the Manchester reformers to say, look, we can do this too. They were all over the place, some big, some small, some in existence for a matter of weeks, some in existence for a few months. And certainly for local history projects, I think it would be very interesting to find out where they were and what records there are of them. It was quite a difficult book to research because it was lockdown. And so archives were shut, libraries were shut. I had started, but I ended up heavily dependent on online sources and finding traces. One of the problems with some of these women is that they're not in mainstream histories except as footnotes sometimes without even their names. And so you have to go and see if you can track down, this woman did this, what was her name? Some of them I never found names for, and some of them are still in the book without names, but that is the fate of women in history, and particularly of working class women in history, that we don't know who they were, or we only see them once. So Alice Kitchen, who made the speech at Blackburn, there's nothing else about her. That's it. That's her appearance in public. But it was historic. She was the first. And it must have taken a huge amount of courage to do that, and not knowing how the crowd would receive them. As it happens, the crowd was happy, but they might have thought it was entirely wrong for them to be there and, thrown things at them until they left the stage. They knew nothing about how they would be received. Often I found that modern histories, counterintuitively, were less likely to talk about the women than older histories. I have no idea why that is, but that is the case. Luckily, quite a chunk of stuff that I was looking for is online. And so in 1817, the government suspended habeas corpus and rounded up all the leaders of the reform movement, and then intercepted the letters from their wives and put them in the archive, basically. And so the letters that the women wrote to the men, again, working class women writing articulate letters, some of which are very political and some of which are very affecting, because, there's one woman who was writing to her husband to say she'd had a cold because her shoes were leaking, because she hadn't been able to afford to buy any new shoes. It was buy shoes or feed the children for the last 6 months since he'd gone. But then other women, other women were much more overtly political in what they wrote. So there are things like that are accessible. I think that there is certainly stuff about the Manchester and Northwest organisations and reformers in the People's History Museum in Manchester and in Chetham's Library in Manchester. Some of this stuff is available. Lots of it, though, is not. You look for it and there's just nothing there. And I think that's one of the difficulties of writing about the history of political women. It just, however much we want it to be there, it just isn't there. Sometimes because it was thought kinder to the women to destroy it so that their names would not be bandied about in public. which was considered shameful.
Interesting. Yeah. Following on from that, especially related to the letters, someone's asked, I was really interested in what you were saying about women's literacy. Were the women's organisations you mentioned creating and distributing pamphlets together?
They were. So the Manchester Address, the Dear Sisters of the Earth address was written, so far as we can tell, by the women together. With all of women's writing, at some point, somebody, with one or two exceptions, somebody pops up and says, haha, but that must have been written by a man. And there's just this sort of assumption that women can't create anything. Women can't think any of this through for themselves. Women are just copying. So one of the criticisms of the Manchester Women's Address is that it uses the same language as the men. And then you think, but why wouldn't it? That's where they live. That's what they're surrounded by. Are we suggesting that working class women in Manchester in 1819 should invent an entirely new political language for themselves and then write it, when they're already doing something unusual, which is writing across the class divide to say to the wives and daughters of their employers and oppressors, join us? And so I think that's really important, that we recognise that women don't have to sound different in order to write their own material. Otherwise, it'd be a very weird literary situation. I think, again, we tend to see working class women through a Victorian prism. The Victorians obviously destroyed the Reform Society, or not destroyed, by the time Victorian age, the Reform Society is gone, so they were not educating women. The Methodist schools had changed, they educated women a lot less. Once children came out of the workforce, then they were no longer attending the factory schools, so they weren't learning at least to read, probably not to write, but at least to read there. It was considered that children of both sexes should be able to read in order to read their Bibles. And as we get into the Victorian period, it sort of just becomes less important for working class girls who can be instructed by men or instructed by their parents or whatever. So female literacy did decline, but at this stage it's clearly very high, and there are many women who sign their names on their marriage certificates, and you can sort of track as people start to make their mark later on.
One of the other questions that's come in is about whether any of these women or groups were involved in other reforms, such as the anti-slavery reform or adult education movements and peace movements and things like that. And sort of adjacent to this, but one of these other questions is asking specifically about access to contraception and how these women could have supported each other, or whether that was at all a concern for some of the radical women involved in these political movements.
That's a really interesting question, because the answer is not quite what you think it might be. But to start with other campaigns, they weren't necessarily involved directly in the campaigns, if only because time, and many of them were had difficult lives and had a limited amount of time that they could devote to other things. However, that said, most people were strongly supportive of the abolition of the slave trade, and almost took it for read that everybody around them was. It doesn't seem to have been a matter for much discussion, except as all the various bills failed in Parliament, people were furious about it, and some of the middle-class women obviously were directly involved in those campaigns and wrote about it. They were certainly involved in anti-war. campaigns. The working class women working class people detested the wars. They were impoverished by them. They felt resentful about the failure of the revolution. And they felt that a war to restore the monarchy in France was outrageous, and that they should be expected to pay for it even more outrageous. And they also objected to war on principle, because obviously it was their sons who ended up as cannon fodder for it. So they were certainly involved in anti-war movements. They were certainly involved in campaigns around food and the food supply. Somebody was asking about bread riots. Certainly they were heavily involved in that. But not just bread. Bread, potatoes and butter was what people mainly wanted. So that, yes, they did look beyond. They tended to have a larger vision than we credit them with. The issue of contraception is really fraught because many working class women were absolutely, fundamentally opposed to birth control. Partly because the death rate of children was so high that if they thought that birth control came in before the social and environmental conditions had been resolved, it was effectively being used to control the numbers of the working classes in order to create the right size of workforce. And that what they wanted was an improvement in their conditions, which would mean that their children would live, which would then mean fewer children. And this is a time of a lot of discussion about population, the effect of population on the economy, what the right course of action was. And in the working class, it tended, not entirely and not always and not in every place, but radical men tended to be in favor of contraception, radical women much less so. And one of the reasons being that they thought it would make it easier for the radical men to ruin women and then abandon them. So there were very mixed views about what the role of contraception was, what its political role was. And in fact, it caused a lot of trouble at various points, both between women and between women and men. And it wasn't until much later that it got more resolved into this as a feminist issue.
That is fascinating and had not even occurred to me as a factor.
No, me neither until I came across it.
Yeah. Two, again, adjacent questions. What was the most surprising thing you discovered in the research for the book? And are there any stories of the women who have particularly sort of stuck out to you or stayed with you?
I knew I was going to get this. It's always very difficult. But I love them all. Sorry, what was the first question?
What was the most surprising thing that you discovered?
The most surprising thing, I think, is really simple. It's just how many women there were doing so many things that I didn't think women did. If you take literature, and this is not a book about literature, but it does include some writers. And one of the things that I just sort of assumed that there weren't many women being published at that time because women, it's a form of the public space and women would be excluded from it. In fact, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women authors, and they were writing about everything. So we sort of think Jane Austen, novels of that kind. They were writing political novels, they were writing romances, but they were also writing adventures and horror stories, and they were also writing about politics. So Anna Letitia Barbauld in the book is a middle-class, middle-aged wife, respectable wife of a minister, a religious minister who writes the most radical stuff in political terms, and got into trouble for it. But prior to doing that, she had been a well-known author. She'd written poetry. She wrote educational books. She wrote books for children. And after it, she wrote all kinds of other things, including bringing together a sort of directory of authors of the 18th century, and was at various points described as the most famous woman of literature in the country, and by Wordsworth as an old snake, because he didn't like her political writing. And yet nobody's heard of her. I never said to anybody yet, Anna Letitia Barbauld, and they've gone, oh yes. And yet they should, as you'll see, particularly some of her writings about her writings about war and the hypocrisy of the government, and also about discrimination, because she was a nonconformist, about discrimination, about how people campaign against discrimination, very modern, very recognizable, when she's writing, what is it you're afraid of that you won't let us in? And why do we have to keep re-establishing ourselves and justifying ourselves to you over and over and over again just for you to take notice of us? Some really good stuff in there, and yet we don't know her. We don't know anything about her. So that was surprising, just that scale. In terms of who do I have a real soft spot for a woman called Susanna Wright, who fought the law and won, though at a cost. Again, a working class woman who was tried for blasphemy, prosecuted by the Attorney General, and the case was heard by the Lord Chief Justice, and she defended herself. And when the Lord Chief Justice tried to shut her up and said, I will hear no more of this, she said to him, you, sir, are paid to hear me. And I just think for a working class woman at that time to stand in a court and say to the Lord Chief Justice, you're paid to hear me and you're going to, is amazing. So I have a real soft spot for her. I also like Anna Letitia Barbauld, and I have a soft spot for Helen Mariah Williams, who lived in France through the Revolution, and in fact couldn't come home. She was in such danger in this country that it was safer to be in France, which was, saying something at that time. And I like the detail about her because she was arrested. Obviously, everybody was arrested during the Reign of Terror, and she was put into the Luxembourg Palace, which was then a prison. And she and her mother managed to find a tea urn and keep the English prisoners supplied with hot drinks during the period of their imprisonment. And I just think that's A, terribly English, B, terribly female, and also terribly human.
That's so delightful.
Yes.
Just really charming and intimate as well. Yes. And yeah.
When people all around them were being taken out and executed, and they might have been next, it's just, it shows what the human spirit can be.
Yeah. A couple of last questions. I think we need to start wrapping up fairly soon, but if there are a few more that we can take, that would be lovely. One question that's come in is about how the focus that you have on the contribution of women behind the scenes, and particularly working class women, and the attitudes that they had to face might have a relevance for the school history curriculum, and what reappraisals might you like to see there?
How long have you got? I think history, I think history in schools at the moment suffers from a very selective approach. I would like to see this period taught, and indeed all periods, taught from the point of view of understanding that all the different strands that there are in society at the moment existed however far back you want to go, and that we should be proud of our radical history and not just cherry pick the bits we want to be proud of and forget the bits we aren't. I would obviously like to see the history of women. I don't like the term women's history because that sounds as though women's history is a thing that's only for women, and actually the history of women is part of the history of the human race, and it ought to be taught as such, so that children should have the impression that women as well as men were part of everything. And particularly in primary schools, I mean, I admit I'm looking at this through as I watch my grandchildren go through what is now the education system. And in primary schools, they're taught almost exclusively about men. So we have Romans, we have Vikings, we have Stone Age men, we have, I don't know what, the Mayans, whatever, and it's all male. So when they have to go to school dressed as Romans, nobody goes dressed as a female. Nobody can name female Romans because apparently there weren't any. So I would like to see history taught completely differently, and I would like to see it taught honestly. So I would like to see the Industrial Revolution taught because it's what's made places that most of us live in what they now are. But I would also like to see it taught honestly, that it was rooted in slave money, that Britain's contribution to destroying the slave trade and ultimately slavery was not about its own goodness of heart, but was the end of a long struggle by both people in European countries and amongst slave communities. That's, there's a whole history there that we're simply not teaching. And as a result, we're teaching children a dishonest version of their own story. So I feel quite strongly I'd like to get hold of I'm not an academic, obviously, but I'd still like to get hold of the whole history curriculum, clean it out and put something new and exciting and interesting in there that would be much more honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually as a final question, something slightly more general, one of the comments that came into the chat was a slightly different focus question. As a 71-year-old, so much of this reflects the arc of my lived life. How important and or valuable do you think it is that we understand such historical context and knowledge for us today? And I realize that's a very wide question, but it's quite a nice
No, that's fine. I understand exactly. I think it's really important because one of the things that happens sometimes generally on the left, but particularly for women, is that we're constantly reinventing or thinking we're the first, or that this hasn't happened to women before, and actually we're the culmination of all the struggles of generations of women who have gone before us, but we don't recognize those struggles because we don't know anything about them. And so, if the only thing that happens as a result of this book is that people go, I see how that story connects to mine, and I feel a connection to that woman. When you watch programs like Who Do You Think You Are, it's that personal connection that moves people. I know they spend their time trying to get people to cry, but because famous people crying is apparently a thing, but it is that feeling of personal identity with an ancestor that moves people in different ways. And I think that as women who have lived through periods of struggle, we ought to be able to do the same with our feminist, or this time not even feminist because neither the word nor the movement exists, but the women who were engaged in some of the same struggles in different ways, but the same struggles 200 years ago. We're all part of the same story. We're all part of the same continuum, and their stories should inspire us, because although things are sometimes bad for us, they're better than they were for them. And they're better than they were for them because women over succeeding decades have fought and inched along and challenged the barriers in front of them, not the barriers somewhere down the line, but the barriers in front of them, moved those out of the way a little bit. And in each generation, that's all we can do, is move the story on a little bit.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this and answering all of these questions. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. It's been an absolute delight to have you, and
Thank
we
you.
are so excited about the book. I've posted the link if you would like to pre-order it through Housmans. We would be very, very grateful. And we will hopefully see you all at another event in the future. But for now, just thank you so much for joining us, Nan, and for
Thank
sharing
you.
all of your work. It's been really great.
It's been a real pleasure, and I hope that when people do get the book, they enjoy it and get something out of it. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about it just as it comes out. It's been a really good evening. Thank you.